the global platform is the next step. It's very hard to get discovered within India itself. Within India, we don't have active and well-known review spaces. Review spaces are the one place where new books get discovered, new voices get discovered. So I think that's a massive challenge in the industry, and particularly in children's.
As a parent, you're always in search of heartfelt books that you can uncover for your children. For me, that search has always been to balance the storytelling, not just by international authors, but equally by Indian authors. It's this curiosity that has led me to have this wonderful conversation with one of the noted authors of children's literature in India. Natasha Sharma has written and published 21 books in the past decade. Many of her books like Icky, Yucky, Mucky, Rooster Raga, Squiggly Takes a Walk, Bonkers, and History Mystery series have become hugely popular among children and won awards. So how has the industry changed since she began her writing journey? Let's find out about this and more. Welcome to Maharani Talks, and I'm your host, Mahati Rangarajan.
Has it been hectic for you with your work during this lockdown, or it's been kind of eased up a bit?
I would say it's eased up a lot, but not in the way that I'm most pleased by, because I tend to be a fairly, I usually write pretty much all the time. I might not write long hours in the day, but it's something I do regularly. And I think last year has been extremely disruptive as a writer for me personally, because my writing space was my home and everyone's invaded my space. So I just find it very hard to develop that rhythm. But yeah, I'm hoping to change that come March 1st, because I don't see things changing outside. So I need to really, sit down and figure it out. But it's been nice that at the beginning of 2020, I did sign on some books, and there's been editing work and all of that, fine tuning work, which is in process. But my newer writing has been slower than I would like it to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's nice that you started up all this new work. But I totally agree with you about, especially children and their online classes and everything. It'll creep up into your time, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And could I ask, what is your favorite time to sit down and write? Is it like in the mornings or evenings?
Yeah, actually, so I usually like writing in the morning. I'm not a very early bird, but after I've done the whatever has to be figured out with the kids, and I would usually pack them off to school, get in a bit of exercise, and I'd sit down to write. And then I'd sort of either it was writing, research, or anything connected to the work that I'm doing. I'd go on till lunchtime. Then I try and get a little bit in before they would get back from school.
Okay.
And then the rest of the day would be very easy. But there were times when if I was, just sitting at home, and at night, I would sometimes use that time to do research for particularly some of my books that needed more research. So I do that then. But my writing would largely be during the time when everybody was off to school and work. So yeah, that's when I prefer writing. And I actually had a rhythm I discovered. I mean, when I thought about it, I had a rhythm in the year as well. So I would find that I write more in the first half of the year, because the second half would start getting disrupted by festivals. So many festivals and travel, and, Lit Fest, a lot of literature festivals as well would be around that time. So travel with that.
That's true.
So I'm sort of like I need my rhythm in the day. So the first half of the year and the first half of the day is my writing time.
That sounds nice.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to your early days. I read that you loved reading and you enjoyed writing.
Yeah.
So were you a voracious reader as a child? Were you very adventurous in going about looking for books?
Absolutely. I was actually, reading was the big thing in my life. I was pretty much never found without a book. I was fairly adventurous for two reasons. One, I just wanted to try many, many different books, voices, authors. And secondly, I grew up in Amritsar, and at a time when really I had a lone bookstore who had a lone shelf of children's books.
Okay.
So the books were very hard to come by. And whatever you came by, you just read it, right? So I remember my dad had this old collection of Billy Bunter. And this was these school stories. And I mean, most children probably have never read it, but they were there. I found them in the storehouse in my house, so I read them. And, I formed very deep and long-lasting friendships with children who were also readers, and then we could access each other's home libraries as a result. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think reading was a massive part of my life, and I was pretty adventurous with whatever I read. It was never gender specific or, only a particular thing to read. Yeah.
Do you remember which book made the most impacted you in the most way as a child?
Very hard to say. I can mention a few names. It's not necessarily the most impact they had, but stuff that really stayed with me for a really long time. And I think this might resonate with a few people. One, of course, were the Hostel series, Malady Tars and St. Clair's,
Yeah.
because I just spent large parts of my school life saying I want to go to a hostel. And I realized when I went to it that it didn't turn out to be like what I'd read, of course, back in the day. But, later on, I think through my college years, Ayn Rand was a massive influence. I pretty much read every book that I could find by her, George Orwell. Some of these names and some of their books really stayed with me for a really long time. I remember there was a biography I read on Michelangelo, Agony and Ecstasy.
Okay.
And it's something that I've never forgotten. So it's just, I think, very scattered books that just stayed with me, that I read at a certain point in life.
Okay. Interesting. How about writing? Did you enjoy writing?
Yes. So writing was always the big constant in my life, right from childhood. I mean, I think one of my earliest pieces that my parents probably preserved was something that I wrote when I was 8 or 9 years old. It was an ode to my mother, and it was a poem I probably wrote to her for her birthday.
Oh, how sweet.
But yeah, I constantly wrote. I never really thought of being a writer, that one day I'd be a writer. But it was a constant in my life right through college, and I would write things for my friends. I would keep a diary. I would sometimes send stuff in for my school magazine. So it was something which was quite a constant all through.
So, but you did a complete turn and you studied maths and
Yes,
management, and you were even a brand manager for Pizza Hut.
yes.
Yeah. So, did it surprise you that one fine day, you decided, no, I'm done with this. Let me go back to my childhood love of writing and books.
I probably wouldn't use the term surprised. If you'd asked me when I was, sitting as brand manager for Pizza Hut in India, whether I was going to be writing books for children anytime soon, I would have just looked at you with a blank face. So it was definitely not on the plans. But I've come to realize now, because with a few gray hair in your head, you realize that you have the benefit of hindsight. I was always one of those children who never really knew what I wanted to do. I mean, I knew stuff that I liked, but I never had a clear idea. And it used to at some point worry me that, everybody seems to know they want to be a doctor or an engineer. And now that I have children of my own, I just look at them and I wonder that how are they expected to know at the age of 14 or 16?
Yeah, it's too young.
So early in life without their own life experiences. But having said that, I think whatever you do ends up being a journey. So, math for me in some way translates to the fact that my mind works in a certain logical way, in a framework, which perhaps in some way leads to the framework of story writing, where one thing leads to the other. So there is that aspect of it. I did an MBA and worked in the corporate field. And therefore, I think today what I do when I look at my books and when something's coming out, I do always tend to see or think through how I can make this reach the audience better. What can we do from a marketing or a promotion perspective? At least some of those things are there, which sort of that part of the journey stays with you. And I got back to writing. And at some point, I think when I look back, there was always this little urge somewhere that I want to go back to the creative space.
Okay.
I just didn't know what form it would take. But that surprise, I would say, is elation that I found my way back to children's literature, because it's something that I wake up to every morning and I'm so thrilled to be in. It's not cumbersome. It's not work. I mean, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of grind involved in it, but it's a happy form of work that you do.
A lot of joy in it.
Yeah, there's a lot of joy in it. Yeah. And surprisingly enough, the one thing I did realize that was that one of the dreams I had as a child was to own a bookshop.
Oh,
It's bizarre. It's like one of the most, I mean, it came to me the other day that I actually had thought through plans of I want to run a bookstore, and I had thought through the layout and what I want the children's section to be like and events in the store. And that had sort of got tucked away in some corner of my brain at some point of time. So I think somewhere there was this thing in my head that, writing or books was somewhere always in the picture.
Okay, but do you also think maybe bookshop sometime you might open one?
No, now that I see the struggles of the bookstores, I'm like, no, I'll stay home with that.
Yeah, wise decision. Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Why children's literature?
I've never had an answer to that. It's basically when I used to write as a child, it wasn't stories for children. But I got back. I put my work aside, my corporate job aside for a bit because I changed cities. I was expecting my first child at that point, and I was also at that point in my career where I felt that I want to be doing something different. And now that I've taken a break, I want to reevaluate what I want to do. And while I was in this completely sort of clueless space, my children were growing up. My son was just about a year and a half or perhaps 2 years old. I was reading lots of children's literature to him, and access today to a lot of books and stories that we never had when we were growing up.
Yeah.
And it was a complete delight. And along the way, I had sort of continued my writing. And it just so happened that one of the days when I was, stuck in a doctor's office clinic waiting with my rather impatient child at that point of time, I started telling him a story. And I kept developing it and I wrote it down. And of course, thankfully, it isn't a book because now when I look back at it, it wasn't the best of writing. But it was like sort of tasting, taking a lick from this thing, which was really delicious. And what I was writing, these ideas started developing. And I was lucky enough to have the time and space for it. So I started writing, and a lot of my family really encouraged me. I started showing it around, got feedback. And I think one thing just led to the other. And I found my way into children's writing. And I think it was just an organic path to it, really.
Okay.
And it was a space that I was enjoying so much that there was never any question of doing any other form of writing after that.
So once you decided to jump in, you've mentioned that you started attending workshops.
Yes.
What was the most challenging part of this phase was for you?
Uh, I think, like with anything else, you have to learn the craft. So you approach it as a reader, but when you're doing it when you're approaching writing for children when you're looking at writing, you really have to go back to understanding the technique and the craft of it.
Okay.
And that involved, if there were workshops that I came across, I attended those. I started with writing picture books, and I remember I got this book when I was traveling called The Art of Writing Picture Books, which was an extremely detailed book, which it gave you ideas on how to develop character, plot. Uh, really important stuff like the pacing in a picture book, the aspect that you have so many layers in a story. So very often when someone sees a picture book, you think, oh, it should be an easy thing to write.
Yeah.
But I find picture books to be the most complex and hardest to write because you have to develop a character and a plot, and often communicate that within 500 words. You have to leave space for the illustrations to do their role. So therefore, you have to, at some level, also be thinking visually, even if you're not illustrating it yourself. It's not just about telling the story, but it's also the emotional development of the character and the different layers that story has. And some of the best picture books appeal as much to the adult who's reading it out to the child as it does to the child.
Right.
That's a tremendous amount of things to get into it. It could even be a wordless picture book for all you know. So there is teach myself a lot of that. I also went back and read a lot of my favorite picture books at the time and other children's books from a technical viewpoint,
Right.
not just as a reader who's reading it to her child, but reading what's working, what's not. So there were those aspects of it. I also sort of had to put aside some things I was comfortable with, sort of get out of my comfort zone. So at the time that I started, I actually used to write a lot of things in rhyme. The first few books I wrote in rhyme. In fact, Icky, Yucky, Mucky, my first book that got published, I first wrote it as a set of 5 sort of mini stories based on a character in rhyme.
Okay.
And I put it together as a collection. And I showed it to an editor who loved the concept, who loved the character per se and what I was trying to do, but said it doesn't work in this. And write it as a single story with characters built into it. And therefore I created Maharaja Icky, Maharani Yucky. I went back to the drawing board. I still wrote it in rhyme because that was my comfort zone. And I remember she kept pushing me. It had been a year and a half after having written my first draft of doing all of this. And she kept pushing me, said that let go of the rhyme because it'll open up your voice. and it'll allow you to do more. And that's the first time I did that with a children's book. Um, so I think it was also a journey of learning and leaving aside things that you were used to doing in a certain way.
Yeah. So how did the idea come about for you for your first book, Icky, Yucky, Mucky?
For Icky, Yucky, Mucky, I mean, I have found inspiration for many of my stories in the most bizarre ways possible. But Icky, Yucky, Mucky was really inspired by, it started with this idea of a monster munch at lunch, which was my first poem. And therefore, the idea of this character that has terrible table manners. It was perhaps a phase where I was constantly telling my children to close their mouth and chew their food,
Yeah.
and not put their elbows on the table and not slurp like that and all of that. And I remember my grandfather and my father, and constantly teaching me this as a child. And it started with that idea, and then it expanded to just terrible habits. Whether it's biting your nails, which I used to do as a child, or picking your nose, and all of this stuff. So this kept building in my head, and the theme led to the characters, and the character then eventually led to the plot. So that's where I found inspiration for Icky, Yucky, Mucky.
Okay. Yeah, it's every parent's dilemma. So that's what we keep repeating to our kids over and over again.
Absolutely.
Did you expect it to do so well? It got received quite well.
So the hope was always there, of course. But as a first-time writer, you are really terrified at how it's going to be received. I think my first indication of it was when I had the first ever reading that I did, which was the book launch at the Kala Ghoda Literature Festival, and in Mumbai. And it was in this beautiful garden space of the David Sassoon Library. It was a house full. They stopped entry. And we ran out of books to sell, and there was a quick rush to try and get more for signed copies. And after that, actually, it's been a constant one that I'm called for readings to schools. I've done online readings now. And I think the greatest joy for me is that sometimes I will come across a child, perhaps in a session, and that child has read this book. It might be a session with my history mystery book, so it's for older children.
Yeah.
But this 12-year-old will come and tell me, I used to have this book of yours, Icky, Yucky, Mucky, and I read it. It was disgusting, and I made my parents read it like 100 times. And the parents say we never forgot the book because we read it so many times to them. So that's a great joy. I mean, that's my way of measuring what an impact or how it did for a child.
Yeah, that's true. So I have read Princess Easy Pleasy, and the correct way of eating mangoes.
The Good Indian Child's Guide to Eating Mangoes. Yes.
Yeah, good Indian childhood. Yeah, I in fact bought your history mystery series. I thought I'll read it to my older kid is 8 years, so it would be apt for him.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's the perfect age to start with those. Yes.
Yeah. What is your writing process? How do you come up with your characters?
I think for each of my books, it's been fairly different. I gave you a sense of Icky, Yucky, Mucky. Since you mentioned Princess Easy Pleasy, it began with the most bizarre way. At the risk of being slaughtered by my daughter, I'm going to say this on a recorded session. But when my daughter was really young, she used to be really fussy about the brand of milk that she would drink. She would get this particular smell the minute she'd get the glass to her. So she would only drink this particular brand of milk. And as a reflection of a parent who gives in, I would carry this Tetra Pak box of milk wherever I would go. When I would travel, I would wrap it in bubble wrap and I would put it into my suitcase and carry it. When I think back to the madness of it, it amazes me. But that's what parents do. We sort of give in to many things, even though better judgment would tell us not to.
Yeah.
So one fine day when I was packing and I was wrapping these boxes of milk and I was getting really annoyed with myself, I had this thought, I might as well take the cow. And it led to this idea. I literally stopped everything and I said, oh, so what if there's this? And the reason I created it as a princess is because it allowed me that aspect of royalty being able to go over the top in things that they do. So they have this plane and she fusses about the milk and the parents give in and say, oh, we must take the cow. So they take the cow and the next time, so it keeps building and it allows for this madness to ensue in the book where eventually the princess says, I want my elephant along with me. The real life elephant is being stuffed into the plane. So the character in this case developed from the idea of having a fussy child, something that many parents are familiar with and many children themselves identify with because they don't like the food in a certain way, or they don't want to try something new. Most children go through this phase of being very close-minded about new things.
Yeah.
And as well as parents who will then actually, give into it with all good intentions, of course, but which ends up leading to unforeseen circumstances, like carrying Tetra packs of milk around the world. So that really was the development of the character. And then, it just became about this fussy princess. So very often, in some cases, in a picture book, the character might come to me in a much more formed way. But when I'm writing the History Mystery series, given there are a lot more characters in it, there is historical context in it.
Yeah.
And even though the characters are not necessarily true to the characteristics of the real figure, because historical fiction, even though it's set in a certain time of India, I have to create my own backstory for many of my characters. So that involves a lot more, whether it's the physical attributes, whether it is the things they say, their fears, the things that they enjoy. So that has a lot more time that I will spend with my character development in that sense.
Okay. For History Mystery series, so did you feel like you were coming out of your comfort zone to write those books?
I did. It's strange you say that, because they took root in a writing workshop. And the particular activity that we were given was to pick a genre that we had never written in and never considered writing in. And it was historical fiction that I picked. And, we were then we were asked to pick an age group and then do this short exercise of writing a story in that genre for that age group. And I picked 8 years, so this broad range of 8 to 12. And given it was historical fiction, and at that point, just from a complete layman perspective, the Indian ruler that came to mind was Akbar, that I was the most familiar with. To give a context,
Right.
In this writing workshop, I wrote a short story. So, which the editors who were running it at that time, they really liked it. And they asked me whether I was willing to therefore expand it into a book, an entire book, which then involved going back to the drawing board and doing a lot of research on the historical character. So it was completely unexpected. It was really, to start with, I had this bunch of questions when I called my editor saying, should I do this? Should I do this? Should I do this? And for everything, she'd say, it's up to you, which was great of her, but really terrifying for me.
Was this Anushka Ravi Shankar of Dakbar?
Yes. So that's what I was left with. And I was like, okay, thanks for that call. But, I think it gave me the freedom and flexibility to go quite mad with it. And if you'd ask me whether I would think of doing historical fiction with so much of humor thrown into it, I hadn't ever thought of doing that. But because it started in that way and I was given the ability and the free hand to take it where I wanted, I wrote the first book. And they immediately, once they read it, I was lucky enough that they got back to me saying, would you like to see these? Because we think it has great potential. So that's really where it started, in a rather unexpected form and fashion.
Okay. So you had to collate a lot of information. Did you have like a system to it? For instance, I once read this interview, heard this interview by Elizabeth Gilbert of Eat, Pray, Love. And she was talking about a system where, she had to research so much about, say, a certain time period.
Yeah.
She would write down each information in an index card and put it in a shoebox.
Okay.
So it became easy for her to pick out those cards and see, okay, this information is useful. Then once I'm done with it, I'll put it in another shoebox. So was it hard for you to sieve through so much of information?
It was, and it still is, because with historical, even though the stories are fiction, they're set in a certain time period in India, and I might create my own additional characters for it. But I want it, if I can figure out an architectural or a setting which works really well, whether it's the Agra Fort or Fatehpur Sikri or a palace which sort of go in Ashoka's story, which actually takes from the suggested layout mentioned in the Arthashastra. There's a tremendous amount of material to sieve through.
Yeah.
I think with my first book, it wasn't as structured in the way that I went about it, but I have developed a system over time where I know that, okay, these are the really key things that I'm searching for. So the first part, of course, is to just figure out what are the sources I can find, whether it be archival, English translations of manuscripts, the N.A. Akbari, the Padshahnama, and many others like this. Then, of course, it is, if I can actually, luckily, it's great if one can travel to the place. But I had been to the Agra Fort in Fatehpur Sikri as an example a few years ago. But I wanted, immediate references for it. And with the ASI and the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, a lot of these places are really well documented with photographs. So you can actually get that reference back in. And the way I collect my information actually is a bit along those lines. So I'm not as organized as an index card in a shoebox, but I actually follow another system, which I forget which author had mentioned it in one of the workshops that I attended. But I have these multiple colored highlighters, and I make lots of notes. Some are on my computer, and but mostly I keep loose sheets of paper, and I keep sorting them with architectural references, with references that I can use in character, with scene references I can use, and I keep color coding. So first I just keep writing it down, and I group them sort of into things that I can add to characters or scenes or plot points, key things that I really find funny or I can twist into something funny. I then go back and I start reading through all of that again, and I keep highlighting with my different colored markers, put lots of tags, and then it slowly starts taking structure because I very often have to go back to each of these.
Okay.
And in fact, in my last one that I wrote, because the sources were so different, and I realized that while I have a bibliography, I really sometimes want to know the exact source where I got that information. So now I tag even that, where I put my footnote and it's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that I know exactly which one even in my handwritten notes, where I got it from.
Okay, so it's always nice to hear how authors go about doing this part of the research, because it's so important for a book, right? You don't realize. I mean, readers don't realize, but it's
Yes,
forms a chunk of an author's work.
absolutely. Yes, especially in these books. Yes.
Yeah. So I want to talk about illustrations. They play a huge role in children's books.
Yes.
So do you take an active part in how the illustrations should look? And, do you sit with the illustrator and tell them how the characters should be etched out?
So it really, it's varied over the last few years, and it varies from publisher to publisher in the way that they work with their author illustrator. Um, so to give you an example with Icky, Yucky, Mucky, I barely gave any input. I would give, of course, a certain amount. The editor sent me the illustrator's brief to have a read, whether I had thoughts on it, but I saw it almost in its finished form with the characters and all, and I loved it. There was not too much input, and I think Anita Balachandran, the illustrator, she was just able to take it to a different place and time with the gorgeous illustration she did in that book. And it was a similar thing with Rooster Raga that Priya Kurian worked on.
Yeah.
In the case of, I think what's happened is over time, sometimes Priya and I have collaborated on a bunch of books since then. And I've been fortunate because her work is just so beautiful. She's, she really gets the humor as well and builds upon it. And I don't have to give inputs. I would never consider doing that because I think she is the master of her work in that sense. But what we do often, perhaps, and it usually goes through the editor, never directly, is if in the case of Princess Easy Pleasy, I had to pull back some of my words to allow for the pictures to speak the story. So that level of editing and a little tweak at the end that was needed, there was a little bit of back and forth on that.
Okay.
When we're doing like the History Mystery series, when I work with Shayoni on that, and with some of them with Anushka, in that, I often will say, okay, perhaps this is a funny aspect of it, or this would be a fun illustration to do, or this, there's so much detail in it that if the illustrator can actually put it into an image, it will be great. So there I do put little notes in of where I feel that it would be good to have an illustration in a chapter book, because there it's sort of limited to depicting what's already in the words. And I can then also give my own research references to them. So if I've sort of got photographic references of an architectural thing, I send it across as well, where possible. So it's a little different for each book, but I think with the picture books, you have to sort of, trust in the form and the illustrator, because they just have so much magic in their hands that we are not even able to envision at times.
That's very true.
Yeah, the only one I'd say differently was the Good Indian Child's Guide, because I think very visually. So I had pretty much, even though they were 100-page books, I had done rough sketches of almost all the pages because there's so much of an interplay of the words and the images. So Shreya still got her entire interpretation. She did such a wonderful job with both the books and took it to a place where I would not have imagined. But there were some references that I gave there.
Okay. You've written about 21 books.
Yes.
I know this might be a hard question to ask, but do you have like a favorite one or a favorite character?
Very hard. I'm often asked this question by all the children when I go for readings, and my answer to them usually is that if you have lots of siblings and you ask your parents who's your favorite, what do they usually say? But having said that, Icky, Yucky, Mucky, of course, will always hold a special place in my heart because it was the first of my creations that I held in my hand.
Yeah.
I usually follow that up by saying that if you're the first child, it does not mean you're the favorite. The other, I mean, this is the character Squiggle. So there are these two books, Squiggle Takes the Walk, which is actually, it's a fiction story, but it's set in the land of punctuation. So it's a great introduction to punctuation. And the second one is called Squiggle Gets Stuck, all about muddled sentences, which talks about the parts of speech.
Yeah, it's very cute.
I'm very fond of that character because I think it's almost autobiographical to me, because it's about Squiggle finding her space in the world, and she's this creative expression of someone who's doodled in the margins of the book, and she doesn't quite follow the rules of punctuation as they are. So in this world of words and letters, she's not really a full stop, she's not a question mark, she's trying to figure out her spot till she figures it's great to be unique and just be this creative expression. So she's like me, finding on her journey of self-discovery. She was also an extremely difficult character to find and create for me.
Okay.
I started with the idea that I have a character in this world of punctuation, and they're in dialogue, and the dialogue reveals what each punctuation does. And I could think of the entire action plot, like, yelling off the page, screaming because the question mark is asking too many questions. And at the end of the scream, she bangs into the exclamation mark. So I had this whole plot. I just didn't know who was my protagonist. And it took me a really long time to find her. So it's sort of, again, the same thing. Takes time to find yourself.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So a lot of your books tend to have humor in it. Is that a style that you're most comfortable with?
It's a style I most enjoy, I think. When I started writing children's books, I hadn't really thought it through that I'm going to write books with humor, or that's the style I like writing. I think each author discovers their voice, their writing voice. It's one that I enjoy tremendously. I think developing that voice for humor takes time. I hope that over the books that I've been writing, I get better at it, at finding that humor that really gets a child giggling, and hooked. And I think humor, very often, if it's done well, can work really well to hook a child to the book and the character. So it's something I think I just found that worked really, it came naturally to me, for want of a better word. And something that I've been able to develop well. So I really enjoy it. I enjoy the fact that I can even use humor to deal with difficult situations. I can use humor to talk about the different kinds of mangoes in the country and the different ways you eat them and the different personalities you could be just because of the way you eat a mango. And that was so much fun to do. I can use humor to talk about cricket.
Yeah.
So it just helps me take a very different spin on many topics.
Have you thought about or thought about exploring other styles as well?
So I think a lot of that exploration has happened in the form of trying different genres of writing. So while I started with writing picture books, and I thought that that's what I'm going to be writing throughout, one of the first few chapter books I wrote was Bonkers, which is a whole book, which is about this boy and his absolutely crazy dog called Bonkers. And it's a different, it's a funny book. It's not nonstop humor, but it's absolutely mad, and it talks about bullying in the storyline. But I find that when I started off writing historical fiction again, the humor was just a part of. They're meant to be extremely action-packed. Lots of facts that you figure out at the end are true, even though you thought everything is fiction. So it's a completely different genre and thought process and way of writing that story versus any picture book I'll write. But the humor still creeps in and has lots of fun. So I think some level of that is always there. The experimenting has been on lots of different genres and formats, whether it's a graphic novel or whether it's, historical fiction.
It's cool. What do you do when you go through a phase where you're not feeling inspired?
Very honestly, for the last 10 years that I've been writing, I've had more ideas that I could pen down, which has been a good thing. And I have been constantly writing. I just felt that the minute the engine starts going, it just goes on and you keep generating ideas. Not all that necessarily need to go into a book, but something keeps, coming in your I think your antenna are up to the world. Having said that, obviously there are times when you're stuck with, okay, what do I do with the next point or the next character, or how do I resolve this part of the story in the most effective way possible? My solution often used to be, has always been actually, I tend to walk around in circles, sometimes around my dining table, which is ridiculous because I can keep getting poked on the corners of the dining table, bumping into it. I think it's just like random walking in some place where I'm not having to see where I'm going and I can just think. And the other thing, bizarrely enough, is that when I just I'm having a shower, I get ideas, and then I have to think: did I put soap? Did I soap myself? Because I'm so lost in my thought that I forget what I'm doing. So I find the showers are very good places to think.
I think maybe something about the running water. I think thoughts just flow.
Could be.
Once you're written the book, do you like to test it out on children through storytelling sessions?
I've never tested my books through storytelling sessions. What I have done, partly because, and with a big caveat here, I'm saying this with a massive this thing. So when I started writing out, my children were exactly the age that I was writing for. And when I would finish a story, I would typically give it to both of them, and I would give the story to a bunch of their friends to read. And initially, when I started, I would keep hovering and asking them, "How's it? How's it? Do they?" And put a lot of pressure on the poor children. And of course, what are they going to say? They're going to say, "Oh, it's great, right?" At some point, I figured, and as they grew older, and of course, there was pushback from them that don't bother us while we're reading. I sort of started lurking in the background because of the fact that my stories are meant to be funny. And very often I'd see this smile creep up because they're lost in the story.
Yeah.
They're reading it and they're lost in the story. And if I'm not there in the picture and somewhere floating around in the background or just leave them to it, they'll come back. My son, I think, is quite, I mean, there would be times he'd tell me that, this was great, but this was getting a little lost somewhere. So I have taken that into account. But I've never sort of based the value of my story entirely on, my children say it's good, so therefore it's good, because they are an extremely biased audience, of course. I have sent it at times, some stories to friends who I feel are big readers and who also have read a lot to their children and who I think will be honest enough to give me some amount of feedback. So I've done that. In one or two books, particularly the book, The Good Indian Child's Guide to Eating Mangoes, which I didn't publish with Duckbill, I published it with Hachette, with HarperCollins. I sent that book to Anushka to read with the question, have I gone mad? Is this too mad a book to consider showing it to an author? Because I'm so afraid of the judgment right now that's going to come my way, because it could either be a lot of fun or I've really gone mad writing a book about how to eat mangoes. And luckily, I mean, she loved it. She told me, of course, that it made me want to get up and eat a mango immediately, which is ridiculous. But she also was able to give me great feedback on the book, which was really helpful, and things that I could perhaps reconsider in some places, etc. So that was great.
Okay. On the topic of, you mentioned, judgment. Does that, when you completed your book and you're out to put it there, does that still bother you at some level, how it's going to be judged, or you over the past decade you're a little more comfortable with that?
I don't know whether I'm ever going to be comfortable enough with it. I've never been bothered about, I've never been worried when the book is coming to the bookstore, not at that stage.
Okay.
The collywobbles and the butterflies I get are when I have to send it out to an editor. And I could be 21 books down and 3 in the pipeline, but it really is a scary moment for me always, because I think I like to experiment with what I'm writing, with the form of writing. Very often picture books are completely different from each other in the form and substance of it. So there is always that little thing niggling then that, I think it's good, but is it really good? And I don't know. I've never really been able to get over that fear of it. It takes me a while. Like, I mean, one, of course, I leave it. I go back to the editing board, even after weeks and months, because I think it helps you get a very objective viewpoint when you're in the middle of writing it. If you've just finished, everything looks good to you. And when you go back to it, you're like, oh my God, I want to change half of this again. It's really bad. So once you get to that point of, okay, I think it's ready, it still takes me a few weeks to be able to hit send, because it's always, and I always send these horrible things. I've got my fingers crossed. Don't think I'm mad, and all of these things that, it's still terrifying.
Okay. Your books have, of course, won awards, like for Bonkers.
Yeah.
On the global stage, do you find it's hard for Indian authors to find enough space for them? Did you have to do a whole lot of promoting and marketing the book to get it seen?
Not with Bonkers. I think it is hard to get seen on the global stage for sure. One, because there are a whole lot of barriers to first getting the book there. I mean, if you need rights, whether the publisher has got international rights for you, whether they have sold international rights, which does not actively happen at all, because most of us work without agents in India. If you want to send a book, even for a fresh manuscript abroad, you need an agent. So there are all those systems and processes in place which most of us are still unfamiliar with, and not too many Indian publishers are necessarily taking it to those international platforms as much as we'd like. I have had with Princess Easy Pleasy, I mean, as an example, Karadi is a lot more active, I feel, on some of these things. So the book has been translated into Greek, it's been translated into Thai. Rooster Raga with Tulika has a Chinese version of it.
Okay.
And there have been some of those which have happened, but it is harder. I mean, I'd say that the global platform is the next step. It's very hard to get discovered within India itself.
Okay.
Within India, we don't have active and well-known review spaces. Review spaces are the one place where new books get discovered, new voices get discovered, particularly in the absence of bookstores, and sometimes bookstores which aren't necessarily the best curated. I mean, that's the reality.
Right.
And now with the world the way it is, I don't even know how many people are going to a bookstore, even as the world is easing out. So it's all online. Online discoverability is even harder. I think there are huge challenges in the industry today, which have been there ever since I got in. There are phases where you have better review platforms and then they dry out. Publishers don't have marketing budgets, large marketing budgets, at least not enough to spread across all the authors that they're publishing.
Yeah.
So there are all those challenges, and therefore certain names which might be, big and established or well known are there, and that's wonderful to have in the industry, but there really needs to be more spaces for people to get, discovered in different ways.
True.
So I think that's a massive challenge in the industry, and particularly in children's.
Like, for instance, I've noticed a slight change in the sense where parents earlier, they picked up books for their children, it would automatically be by a foreign author.
Yeah.
But now I feel there are more parents, like Indian parents, picking up equal number of books by Indian authors. So do you find that change as well?
I do, definitely. And I think a large part of it has to do with the fact that, one, there is beautiful content that has been created over the last many years by, leading publishers, independent publishers who have done such, created such wonderful works, be it Tara Books or Karadi or Tulika, Duckbill that went on to do so many, and, now under Penguin. And now the larger publishing houses themselves opening children's, larger children's sections where they are publishing and content from within the country. There's been a lot, and there continues to be a lot. So that's the great positive of it. So one is, of course, that today there is a lot more than just beyond folk tales.
Right.
There is contemporary Indian writing. There are new illustrators. There are new voices. There are new formats which are being explored. So that's wonderful. The other aspect of it is that, yes, there are fabulous champions, in different cities and places for children's literature emerging out of India. In some forms, it's independent bookstores, like in Mumbai. I mean, Kahani Tree has an amazing collection. Kitab Khana, whenever a tree opens, they have beautiful, they keep children's literature emerging from India, a lot of those. And they really know what's on their shelves, and they can guide a customer to, discovering a lot of that for themselves. There's One Up in Delhi, Cool School in Gurgaon. I mean, there are so many around the country today where they actually make the effort to know what's on their shelves, and for their readers and parents to discover these voices.
Yeah.
And in equal measure, literature festivals like Bookaroo, Peek a Book, which have done really amazing things for children's authors in India, to interact with children and parents and to be discovered. So I think there's been a lot that has happened positively in the industry, but there's just a lot more that needs to be done still.
Yeah, I hope the market keeps evolving.
Yes.
Whose work inspires you now? Whose books you really loved?
It's very hard to put names, but I would just say that, from the time that I started, when I went back to reading children's literature to my children, and even now, I identify with a lot of authors who either use a lot of humor in their writing, who have unexpected things going on, or who have a massive understanding of, particularly in picture books, the interplay of images, illustrations, and words. And in that regard, I would say works of Oliver Jeffers, Emily Gravett,
Yeah.
Roald Dahl, of course, they've really stayed with me. In India, Anushka Ravishankar, I mean, she is beyond phenomenal in the way that she creates characters, her style of writing, the humor that she has, and her ability to write nonsense, which is unparalleled, very honestly, in the country. I love the works by Paro Anand in India. I think their authenticity of voice is phenomenal. So her writing for teenagers, young adults, I really enjoyed that. I read a book of hers recently called Like Smoke, which was really very, very enjoyable to read and very thought provoking. And in the similar voice, I would say Catherine Applegate internationally. Again, I love her voice of writing. I love the authenticity of the character. I remember this book called The One and Only Ivan, where I read the first chapter and I just sat back and said, it's like she's inside the head of this gorilla and I can hear what the gorilla is thinking. The ability to do that is something which is, I hope I get there one day to that level.
Other than yours, 5 books that you would recommend?
Oh gosh, this is the toughest question, by the way, because it's such a long list. I'm just going to say what comes at the top of my head pretty much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'm going to start with Anushka's Captain Coconut and the Case of the Missing Bananas. It's a mad, mad book. My son, who was fairly older, he was like literally shouting at the character in the book and laughing, and I was like, he can't hear you. I mean, just read the book. I would say Like Smoke, as I mentioned, of Paro's. The One and Only Ivan, definite read.
Okay.
There is this. It's a wordless picture book called The Arrival. I'm forgetting I'm completely blanking on the author's name. It's in my it's in my living room actually. But it's a really fabulous wordless, not really a picture book, but a graphic book, but phenomenal in the way the story is told. So I would definitely recommend that.
Okay.
And have I got to 5?
I think 4.
Matilda is one that stayed with me forever, of Roald Dahl. So I just love that. And I would say just read any book if your children are young. Then Oliver Jeffers and Emily Gravett. Oh my God, I love them. Yeah, they're just another level.
I know Oliver Jeffers is like, I think everyone's favorite.
Yes.
Or at least figures in their list. So
yeah.
So it's been 10 years, 21 books down. So how's the journey been like for you?
It's been really wonderful. I mean, I would never have thought starting out that I am where I am in terms of, a collection of work being varied. I do feel that I've been really blessed to be in a good space. And the industry and the people in the industry are wonderful. So it's a really lovely space to be in as a writer. They're very supportive of each other. As a writer myself, I feel good about the fact that my writing has evolved, and whereas I like to keep going back and forth. So I'll write a chapter book, I'll go back to writing a picture book, which is my first and all-time love. And I feel that I have, I'm getting to a point where I am going to be a lot more satisfied with what I've written than even earlier, which is, I think there has to be constant learning as an individual and as a writer.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good space. There are, of course, as I mentioned, very often I'm extremely frustrated because there are no books in the bookstores. The distribution is rubbish. I'll be calling up the editor and saying, why aren't the books there? I mean, I know of people who say, we're looking for your book and where do we find it and how can it be so hard? And, all of those challenges go on. And then, of course, somebody will say, well, it's a lot better than what it was 10 years ago. And I'm like, I don't know. But I think every industry has its struggles. And I think there is a lot still that needs to be done in terms of, so there is the joy of creation. There is the aspect of a lot needing to be done with regards to figuring out how your book gets discovered. That's one part of it. There is the aspect of a lot of us love going to schools to read books for children. Because we want them to be familiar with our books, but also because the school, the parents, us, we all want to develop readers.
Yeah.
And when you meet an author, you hear the story behind that story. Perhaps it intrigues you enough to read the book. But I think increasingly there is this thing that you want to be recognized for the time that you're coming to spend, because you're not just coming to promote your book, you're coming to, in a way, hopefully create a reader who will go on to read many other books.
Yeah.
So that appreciation of that time, the value to the time, the fact that, allow you to sell your books there, as in at least have a vendor who will sell it, because you want to close the loop. If they like my book, they should ideally want to read it and therefore be reading a book and therefore read another book. So there's a lot of those aspects which need to, I think, still get developed.
Okay.
But having said that, it's a lot better. When I started out, I started going to a lot of schools, and many had really not had an author come in and read. And today it's something which is a lot more prevalent, understood, what's expected, what the school expects, what the author expects. So it's ever evolving. I think it's a good space. And I'm just extremely thankful and blessed that I found my way into this world.
Lovely. So what are your plans for this coming year?
Oh, the plans are to sit in the hot seat, which is my writing seat, and sit and write eventually. I think I need to stop making excuses. I'm usually extremely disciplined. It's just been a year where discipline has gone out of the window.
Yeah, it's been a tough year. So
yeah, so I think that's my single goal, write something. Because I think I get to a point where I can't sleep at night because I have lots of thoughts floating around in my head. They need to go on paper. So I really need to just, sit and write. That's the big plan. Simple enough to follow, hopefully.
Do you have like a deadline in mind?
March 1st, totally. March 1st.
Okay, great.
I'm telling everyone that. I'm telling my editor also that. She's like, so what's happening? I'm like, March 1st. That's what.
So we could expect a book from you soon,
Yes, hopefully. Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, Natasha. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. No, it was absolutely wonderful. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks for listening to this conversation. Hope you enjoyed it. You can find Natasha Sharma's books online or any bookstore near you. Catch you soon.